Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm going to talk to you about something a little bit different today compared to my normal sort of philosophical stuff or stuff to do with atheism and whatnot. I'm going to talk to you about social media, open source intelligence, mainstream media, and the sinking of the Russian warship, the Moskva. What happened is, goodness me, it must not even yesterday, but the day before, 10 o'clock at night, I think UK time, I posted on Facebook, my own social media, after gleaning information from lots of various sources on Twitter. I use Twitter quite a lot at the moment, and open source intelligence sources, which this idea that these days, something like the war in Ukraine, so much data is being shared on Telegram and Twitter and all these different platforms that give information about, tanks that have been blown up, APCs, troop movements, everything. And you get open source intelligence aggregators who are people who are looking at all these different other sources and aggregating all the information, putting it together and presenting effectively old school, what would have been old school intelligence, on a war, on a conflict, on troops, on forces, and so on and so forth. And OSINT or OSINT, open source intelligence, is a thing. It's a really big thing. In fact, I know someone who works in a private company producing open source intelligence, packages and whatnot to sell on to actual armed forces and other people and whatnot. So this is a big thing. The particulars of this event were, as I said, the Moskva. I reported on Facebook that the Moskva was hit by 2 Ukrainian anti-ship missiles, 2 Neptune missiles. And why this was interesting is because I reported it, and it took about 8 hours for the mainstream media to then report it. Literally 8 hours. I think maybe the initial kind of glimmers maybe were about 5 hours, but to properly report it, about 8 hours. And even then, I'll go on to talk about what the differences were with how the mainstream media reported it. But I was wondering, why is it taking this long? And okay, they've got to check facts and find out about whether this is Ukrainian propaganda, Russian propaganda, and whatnot. But there was this huge distance in time, length of time, between social media reporting this and open source intelligence sources reporting this and mainstream media. And it's quite incredible. And this is routinely happening. I'm routinely finding out information 5, 6, 7, 8 hours before you see it on the mainstream media. And part of me thinks that actually some of the reporters don't have their ears close enough to the ground as far as open source intelligence goes, because I can't understand why there would be that lag otherwise. Now, what was interesting with the Moskva is that, as I said, I reported, because it had been reported elsewhere from Ukrainians themselves, government sources, that the Moskva had been hit by 2 Neptune anti-ship missiles. And then there were other reports saying, it's listing on its side and it's going to sink. Anyway, when the mainstream media finally did report it the next day, they couched it in this way. So BBC, CNN, all these different sources, media platforms, saying Russians are saying that their flagship Moskva warship is on fire, and the fire has set off some ammunition, and it's at the moment, it's on fire and it's being towed back to Sevastopol by some tugs. But the Ukrainians have said as well that they have hit it with their own missiles. We're not sure exactly what's happened, but there you go. And I thought that was really interesting because they are starting with giving you the Russian account, then going on to give you the Ukrainian account and letting you kind of make up your mind. And they say, look, either way it's bad, because either it's Russian incompetence or it's Ukrainian military guile or strength or whatever. And either option is bad for the Russians. Yeah, true. But why is it that you are presenting the Russian account first? Like, as a reporting organisation, you should really look at what's going on here. First of all, the Ukrainians reported this 3 hours before the Russians first reported it. So the Ukrainians said, we've hit this cruiser with 2 Neptune missiles. Silence from the Russians, silence from the Russians. 3 hours later, the Russians say, oh, we've got fire on board one of our ships, and it's set off some ammunition. So, big fire. But that was 3 hours later. So what best explains, this is the inference to the best explanation, what better explains the data that the Ukrainians got there 3 hours before the Russians? Because that looks to me like the Ukrainians hit the cruiser and the Russians are panicking and then coming up with some ad hoc rationalization as to what's gone on. But it certainly looks like the Ukrainians are correct. Then we look at prior probabilities. So we know that the Ukrainians have broadly been correct on all the things they've claimed. I think the only thing is they claimed early on in the campaign that they shot down 2, is it IL-96, 2 big Russian planes, and there's actually no evidence of that yet. So that looks to be a claim that hasn't been upheld. But otherwise, pretty much everything has been upheld. Russians, on the other hand, have been talking absolute nonsense throughout the whole campaign. So on prior probabilities, who should we believe? The Ukrainians, it's in their best interest to be fairly truthful. If they start lying about stuff, they're going to lose the information war because people won't trust them. But actually, they've been fairly trustworthy in what they've claimed. Russians, on the other hand, have not. So therefore, we should really probably believe the Ukrainians over the Russians. Then it gets even worse for the Russians, because what did the rest of their fleet in the Black Sea do? It turns out that the rest of their fleet sailed away further south. Now, if the Moskva was on fire, had an accidental fire on board, those other ships should have made a beeline for Moskva and should have been coming to help it. But what did they do? They sailed further away to get out of missile range from Ukraine. In other words, the actions of the rest of the fleet are best explained, or really only explained, by the account that the Ukrainians fired missiles at Moskva and they want to escape a similar fate by sailing out of missile range. So you start putting all these things together, and it's all fascinating as well. Open source intelligence, like some people are saying this is just propaganda from the Ukrainians. This hasn't happened. I'll believe it when I see pictures. And then literally within minutes, I mean, this is way before the Russians have said anything, there were people posting links on Twitter to live access to the Morse code emergency sort of Mayday signals that Moskva was sending out. So you're like, don't believe us? Check this link and you can listen to the ship sending out distress signals. Like, wow, well, this is where we're at with the war being fought online when in full view of everyone, and you can access distress signals from a warship that is going down. Then the Ukrainians said, right, it sunk, it's sinking, it's sunk, hours before mainstream media and the Russians said that. So again, they're presenting stuff, but the mainstream media are not only giving the Russian account like equal, so a parity with the Ukrainian account, saying, but they're actually giving it a little bit more by placing the Russian version first. They're saying this is what the Russians are saying, this has happened to their ship. And by the way, the Ukrainians are saying this. Hang on, that to me, if I'm watching that means it looks like broadly the Russians are more likely to be saying the truth here. Well, that's the way you're presenting it. Whereas actually, if you look at all the data points, if I, in my living room and in my bed on my mobile phone, can give you a better account of what's going on than you are presenting to your audience, there's something going wrong here. Like, I think the mainstream media are sometimes doing a poor job of reporting this stuff early and actually accurately, and by accurately I mean like using all these data points to say actually this is most probably what has happened. They seem to be afraid to say this is probably what's happened in case that isn't what's happened. But if you catch it, like, so I would have reported something like that, reported the Moskva going down as something like this. Ukrainians have just reported that they have hit the Russian warship Moskva with 2 Neptune missiles. On the other hand, the Russians have claimed, although their claim was 3 hours later than the Ukrainian claim, that the ship caught fire and some new munitions caught fire. In other words, you're presenting a far more, accurate state of affairs, which is this is what the Ukrainians said, and they said it first, and this is why this is the other data that supports that state of affairs, and this is what the Russians say, who are also known for overt propaganda and mistruths, etc., etc. So I think there's a really there's a lesson to be learned, I think, from mainstream media there, and it's just a fascinating landscape. The social media open source intelligence landscape is fascinating. We are, whether it be from dashcam videos or they still have mobile phone network in virtually all of the war zones. So they're taking pictures of tanks and APCs and whatnot being blown up and sending it up to the cloud to be accessed by everyone. And then you get aggregators who are like Oryx, who are counting all the tanks and armaments and howitzers and verifying whether they have been seen before or whether these are new, and adding them to databases and showing that Russians are losing 3 to 4 times as many pieces as the Ukrainians. And that back in World War II, back in any other conflict previously, that's just not been a thing. It's incredible that we have that intelligence at our fingertips 24/7. It's incredible. What does it mean for the Moskva to be sunk? Well, it's a huge morale boost for the Ukrainians and a huge morale hit for the Russians. But I don't think the media are saying enough about how important this is from a air defense point of view. So although Moskva has attacking capabilities, it hasn't sent, I don't think, that many cruise missiles out in the conflict, but it can. It's got a whole load of armaments on board. So it is offensively fairly useful for the Russians, but in the long term, that's not huge. Like, if that goes down, okay, they won't be able to send out a few missiles from there, but they should be able to do it from elsewhere or whatnot. But it's still a dent in their capabilities. But actually, I think the importance is the defensive capabilities. So the defensive capabilities means that it can hit Ukrainian aircraft, whether it be UAVs, which are unmanned sort of aerial vehicles, so your drones, or actual planes or helicopters. In the Black Sea, north of the Black Sea, that was controlling air defences, which meant that the Ukrainians, had trouble providing either supply through the air or attacking in the air. They had to be really careful. Now that that's been sunk and the other ships have gone further south, this has huge ramifications, I think, for the aerial battle. And the Ukrainians should have more capabilities to be able to attack or supply by air than they had previously with that ship being where it was and having the capabilities it had. So actually, I do think the sinking of this ship is more than just a morale boost, but it actually really affects the Russian air defense capabilities going forward. And then you're thinking, well, does this affect whether Mariupol can be, supplied as it was a few weeks ago, was having secret air supplies until one helicopter was found and shot down, and that's how they survived that long. Now they have been unable to be resupplied. That it's looking like Mariupol will fall in the next day or so, and all those troops are being sucked in, all those Russian troops, and then be supplied up to Donbass, and you've got a land bridge from Russia straight through to Crimea and beyond. So Mariupol is super important, but with air capability now being slightly improved for the Ukrainians, or is it that improved? Can they start doing things, or do those ground forces in the Crimea and up and around Kherson and places, are they able? How much of a loss is in Moskva really in terms of air defense is kind of what I'm saying. But I think if I was a Russian commander, I'd be pretty or very angry, and a bit worried that the aerial capabilities of Ukrainians would be improved with the sinking of the ship. But it's the most expensive piece of kit that's been lost. It's a huge loss, really, in terms of the kind of information war and the social media war. Like for them to lose that, ooh, yes, it will hurt financially if they're going to replace it, but that's a long-term thing, because you can't just build a warship straight away. But man, that's going to hurt at home. Now, the worry is the better the Ukrainians do, the more angry the Russians and Putin get, and the higher the chances of lashing out and retaliating and escalating. So you will get it. Already some of the Russian news networks are saying we should flatten Kiev. This is an attack on Moscow, effectively on Russia. So it's one of those awful scenarios where the better that the Ukrainians do, the worse it might be for them in the long run, because it invokes the anger of Putin and Russia at large, and so the retaliation could be harsh. But the flip side is, what can they retaliate with? Because actually, okay, tactical nukes, but the American army basically, all the armed forces have like 90% guided munitions and 10% dumb munitions. That means that 90% of their weapon, their sort of missiles and stuff that they fire, has technology to guide it to a particular place, and only 10% are dumb sort of artillery or bombs that you drop from planes that are just like random bombs, and they will go wherever you drop them. You sort of there, whereas Russians have 90% dumb munitions and 10% guided, and they have used up a shed load of their guided munitions, which means that any big retaliation, they're using fewer and fewer cruise missiles because they don't have many left in their armory, and they can't replace them easily because they're either made in Ukraine or they're made in Russia, but the spare parts, they can't get them. They can't get the microchips. They can't get, due to all the sanctions. And so going forward is a bit of a problem. Yes, if Putin gets angry and says, right, we're going to flatten Kyiv, how do they do that, considering they've pulled all their forces back from there and they don't have that many missiles? Is it a time for tactical nukes, etc., etc.? So I don't know. Interesting times, but prima facie, it looks really good that Ukraine have done what they've done, and it's not looking good for the Russians going forward. It will be a long attritional battle in the region called Donbass, where the Ukraine have had a defensive line for 8 years, and they are dug in, and they've done an amazing job in keeping back the Russian forces. You hear about Kiev and Sumy and Kharkiv and Mariupol and Kherson and all these places, but actually what you haven't really heard is that down the Luhansk and Donetsk line, the Ukrainians have held there for 50 days and not given up any land, really. And they are, because they're in a really good dug in defensive position, and to the rule of law really in war is, if attackers are going to lose way more than defenders when they attack, especially in sort of scenarios like that, where you've got dug in troops and hardware, and you're trying to overrun them with your own hardware, you are going to lose a lot of hardware and troops. So going forward, even if Russia pushes for this big offensive, it's going to cost them a lot, an awful lot, and their best hope is some kind of pincer movement where they surround them from the back, coming down from Izium and all that. But you can check out the maps to look at how that might happen. it's just not looking good for Russia. And I've written an article recently saying Putin can't win. There's no situation now where Putin can win. And I might do a separate video on that because I think it's an important point to make. And it's more and more evident as the days go by. But anyway, that's my little sort of random talk about a Russian warship being hit. You've got, the takeaway points are, you've got much better warrants to believe what the Ukrainians say than the Russians. And all the data supported the Ukrainians' account of what happened. I was finding out about this 5 to 8 hours before mainstream media even mentioned it. So, what does that say about information in the modern age and wars? Thanks for dropping by and watching this. As ever, question everything, particularly yourselves and the sources from that you use to find out your information. Question them, but on the understanding that once you've evaluated those sources, there are some pretty darned good sources for information on this war out there that are really close to the ground and really, really quick, and it's just amazing how quickly we can get information about a war zone, where insane stuff is happening, and yet it's also being reported on social media almost straight away. Nuts. Thanks and goodbye.